The grand spire of the Ethon Concordat pierced the upper atmosphere of the capital world, a needle of crystalline glass and oscillating light that stood as a testament to 10,000 years of unified consciousness. Inside the Hall of Assessment, the air hummed with the subsonic vibration of 1,000,000 active processors, a sound that was felt in the marrow rather than heard by the ear. It was the sound of the lattice, the neural network that connected every sentient mind of the 20 core species, a river of pure data that flowed through the thoughts of the elite, granting them the collective knowledge of an empire in the space between heartbeats. The room was vast, a circular amphitheater rising into the shadows of the vaulted ceiling, where holographic constellations shifted in real time, mirroring the galactic movements outside. In the center of this coliseum of intellect sat the candidates, the future architects of the galaxy, arranged in concentric circles of floating grav chairs. They were the prodigies of the Concordat, the multi-limbed Krell whose brains possessed dual hemisphere independence, the ethereal Vari, beings of bioluminescence and light, and the stoic, rock-skinned Aurochs. Each of them was plugged in. Shimmering filaments of light extended from the base of their skulls, weaving into the floor, connecting them to the infinite ocean of the Grand Archive. Their eyes were rolled back, glowing with the blue pulse of the data stream, their bodies twitching slightly as they processed information at speeds that defied the laws of organic biology. Among this sea of pulsating light and cybernetic integration, there was a single jarring void. In the outermost ring, isolated by a gap of empty floor that seemed to represent a social quarantine, sat the human. He sat at a physical desk, an archaic, slab-like construct of polymer and metal that looked like a relic from a museum of the primitive era. There were no filaments connecting his skull to the floor. There was no soft glow emanating from his eyes. He wore a simple, unadorned gray tunic that contrasted sharply with the ceremonial robes and armored carapaces of the other candidates. His hands, pale and fleshy, rested on a mechanical input console, a device with physical keys that required kinetic force to actuate. To the aliens surrounding him, the sight was not just pitiable, it was offensive. It was an affront to the very concept of the assessment. The candidate, whose name was Elias, sat in perfect stillness, his eyes open, staring blankly at the obsidian screen in front of him, which was currently dark. He was a stone in a rushing river, an object of silence in a room deafening with telepathic noise. High above the amphitheater, in the observation balcony where the magisterium convened, Scion Vales of the Krell clicked his mandibles in a rhythm of disdain. He adjusted his own neural dampeners, filtering out the background static of the thousands of minds below to focus on his peer, Proctor Xylos. Vales leaned over the railing, his compound eyes fracturing the image of the human below into 1,000 shards of pathetic isolation. It is a farce, Vales projected his thought directly into Xylos's mind, a habit of the upper caste that bypassed the clumsy inefficiency of spoken language. Why does the Council insist on humor this species? Look at him. He is severed, disconnected. He attempts to navigate the complexity of a Class 5 stellar governance simulation using what? Biological wetware. He is trying to calculate slip-space trajectories with a chaotic lump of meat. Vales's thought carried the emotional texture of cold amusement mixed with irritation. To a Krell, whose mind was augmented from birth to process throughts in parallel streams, the human looked like a cripple trying to outrun a starship. Proctor Xylos, an elder Vari whose form rippled with the colors of a dying nebula, floated gently, his tendrils caressing the data stream. The Terran Union petitioned for entry into the high governance, Xylos replied, his mental voice sounding like the chime of crystal. The charter dictates that any species may send a candidate to the assessment. If they fail, they are relegated to the protectorate status, client species, managed by their betters. If they pass, they gain a seat on the council. We do not deny them the right to fail, Vales. Let the primitive creature break his mind against the rocks of the simulation. It will be a lesson in humility for his entire race. Down in the amphitheater, the candidates were beginning to sink. The air grew heavy with the psychic pressure of the imminent exam. The assessment was not merely a test of knowledge. It was a total immersion simulation of managing an interstellar empire through a period of catastrophic upheaval. It tested economic management, military strategy, diplomatic intuition, and ethical rigidity. The neural interface allowed the candidates to process millions of variables per second, accessing the historical precedents of 1,000 wars and 1,000,000 trade deals instantly. They could live 1,000 simulated years in the span of an hour. The human, Elias, reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, metallic object. Vales zoomed in with his optical implants. It was a pair of spectacles, glass lenses in wire frames. The scion let out a chittering, audible laugh that echoed slightly in the hush of the hall. The human placed the glasses on his nose, blinked once, and then cracked his knuckles. The sound, crack, 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 was disgustingly biological, a reminder of the friction of bone and cartilage. "The brutality of it," whispered a candidate from the aurochs species, sitting 2 seats away from Elia's. The aurochs spoke aloud, a rare breach of protocol, but the absurdity of the moment demanded it. "He intends to use manual input. By the time his nerve impulse travels from his brain to his finger to press a key, we will have already structured the economy of a sector. He is fighting time itself." The other candidates, those awake enough to notice, sent ripples of amusement through the local subnet. They mocked the human's solitude. They pitied the silence of his mind. To be unconnected was to be blind, deaf, and mute in the universe of the Ethon. They saw him as a tragic figure, a representative of a species that had reached the stars through brute force rather than elegance, dragging their primitive bodies into a realm of pure thought. Suddenly the lights in the grand spire extinguished, leaving only the starlight from the transparent ceiling and the blue pulses of the candidates' interfaces. The voice of the High Archon boomed, not through speakers, but directly into the skulls of everyone present, vibrating the very fluid of their brains. "The assessment begins. The scenario is the collapse of the Antares meridian. Parameters: cascade failure of stellar infrastructure, simultaneous biological plague, and hostile incursions from extragalactic entities. Difficulty: absolute. You have 1 standard hour to stabilize the sector or face total extinction. Begin." The room exploded into silent chaos. For the candidates connected to the lattice, the world dissolved. Their physical bodies became irrelevant husks as their consciousness was uploaded into the simulation. They were no longer students in chairs. They were omnipotent overseers of virtual star systems. They saw the flow of resources as rivers of light, the movements of fleets as geometric equations, the spread of the plague as a darkening corruption in the code. They accessed the Grand Archive instantly. Vales, watching the telemetry from the balcony, saw the Krell candidate, a prodigy named Crox, immediately partition his mind into 40 subroutines. Crox began micromanaging the agricultural output of 12 planets while simultaneously directing fleet maneuvers. It was a symphony of efficiency. The Vari candidate merged with the diplomatic AI, running billions of conversation simulations to negotiate peace treaties with the invaders. The aurochs candidate began fortifying the stellar borders, calculating shield harmonics with the precision of a quantum computer. And then there was Elias. He did not slump forward. He did not go limp. He sat upright, the blue light of his physical screen casting a harsh, pale glow on his face. His fingers began to move, clack, 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 clack. The sound was agonizingly slow compared to the nanosecond processing of the others. On his screen, lines of text scrolled. He was not seeing the simulation as a sensory reality. He was seeing it as raw data, streams of text and topological maps. He was reading. He was pausing to think. He took a sip of water from a flask he had brought. The arrogance in the hall turned to bewilderment. He was losing valuable seconds. While the Krell candidate had already issued 4,000 commands, the human had typed only 1 line of code. "He is drowning," Vales sneered, watching the diagnostics. "The simulation is generating entropy at a rate of 1018 cycles. The plague is spreading exponentially. He cannot type fast enough to quarantine a single city, let alone a planet. This is painful to watch. End it, Archon. Mercy dictates we unplug him before the stress causes a cerebral hemorrhage." But the Archon did not intervene. The assessment continued. Inside the simulation, the connected candidates were flying. They felt the rush of godhood. But as the minutes ticked by, the scenario began to mutate. The difficulty, absolute parameter, was not a hyperbole. The simulation was designed to learn from the candidates, to adapt to their logic and counter it. When the Krell candidate optimized food distribution to prevent famine, the simulation introduced a logistical fungal rot that thrived on the specific transport vectors he had used. Because the Krell relied on the Grand Archive's historical data, he applied a standard fungicide solution. But the rot was a mutation. E-solution failed. The Krell panicked, his mind racing through millions of archived files for a counterprecedent, but the archive had none. The lattice fed him panic loops, the collective fear of the failing population feedbacking into his own neural pathways. The Vari candidate, attempting to negotiate with the invaders, found that the enemy AI did not follow logical syntax. It spoke in riddles, in emotional metaphors that the logical processors of the lattice could not parse. The Vari's interface tried to translate the poetry of war into binary, and in doing so, lost the meaning. The negotiations collapsed, and the invasion fleets accelerated. The Aurochs candidates' shields held, but the energy drain caused the sun of the primary system to destabilize. The perfect calculation had failed to account for the stellar fatigue of an aging star. The efficiency of the neural interface was becoming a trap. The candidates were processing data so fast that they were reacting to symptoms rather than understanding the disease. They were caught in feedback loops of logic, applying perfect mathematical solutions to problems that were fundamentally chaotic. The lattice was an echo chamber of pure reason, and the simulation had shifted into the realm of madness. Back in the hall, the physical bodies of the candidates began to convulse. Smoke rose from the interface ports of the Krell candidate. The Vari candidate was glowing erratically, strobing with distress. The Aurochs was bleeding from the nose. The Magisterium leaned forward, anxiety replacing their arrogance. "The system is overloading them," Proctor Xylos murmured, his tendrils curling in concern. "The complexity index has surpassed the archive's predictive models. They are looking for answers in the database, but the answer isn't there. They don't know how to improvise." And in the silence of the screaming minds, the sound of the mechanical keyboard grew louder. Clack, 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 clack. The rhythm had changed. It was no longer tentative. It was a rapid, staccato drumming like the beat of a war drum. Ilias had not tried to manage every planet. He had not tried to micromanage the grain shipments or the shield harmonics. He had spent the first 20 minutes doing absolutely nothing but reading the scrolling logs of the invaders' transmissions and the biological reports of the plague. He had ignored the screaming alerts of the dying cities. He had let them fall. To the observers, it looked like incompetence apathy. But Ilias was looking for a pattern. He wasn't connected to the archive. He had no voice in his head telling him what the standard protocol for a Class 5 plague was. He only had his own intuition, that ancient, forged-in-fire human capability to stare into the abyss and find a shape in the darkness. He realized something the machine minds missed. The plague and the invaders were synchronized. The biological markers of the virus matched the comms burst frequency of the alien fleet. The invaders weren't just attacking, they were terraforming. The plague wasn't a disease, it was an inoculation for them. The Krell candidate was trying to cure the plague to save the population. The Vari was trying to talk to the invaders. Ilias realized they were the same problem. Ilias typed a command. It was not a complex algorithm. It was a simple, brutal instruction. He routed the energy from the planetary shields, the very shields the Aurochs was desperately trying to maintain, and dumped it directly into the atmosphere of the primary gas giant in the system. "What is he doing?" Vales shouted, gripping the rail. "He just lowered the defenses. The fleet will glass the planet. He has doomed the simulation." On the main holographic display, the result of Ilias' command played out. The energy dump ignited the upper atmosphere of the gas giant, turning it into a massive, glowing beacon of radiation. It didn't damage the fleets. It didn't cure the plague. But the specific radiation frequency acted as a massive jamming signal. The comm bursts that controlled the plague were severed. Instantly, the virus went inert. The invaders, whose navigation relied on that same frequency, were blinded. Their ships collided, formations breaking. Ilias didn't stop. He didn't try to save everyone. He looked at the map, saw the unsavable sectors, and typed a command to detonate the warp gates leading to them. He sacrificed 3 billion simulated lives in a heartbeat. Clack. Done. By destroying the gates, he created a quarantine zone that no ship could cross. He had stopped the bleeding by cutting off the limb. The alien candidates, still stuck in the loop of trying to save everything because the archive said every life was a resource to be optimized, could not comprehend the sacrifice. They froze, their processors overheating as they tried to calculate a scenario where 100% survival was possible. Ilias knew 100% was impossible. He accepted 60%, and 60% survived. The simulation clock hit 0. The hall went pitch black. The hum of the lattice died instantly, leaving a ringing silence that was painful to the ears. Then the emergency lights flickered on, bathing the room in harsh red, then settling into a clinical white. The candidates slumped in their chairs. The Krell student vomited a blue fluid. The Aurochs was unconscious. The Vari was dim, their light barely a flicker. They had failed. The simulation had crushed them under the weight of their own processing power. In the outer ring, Elias pushed his chair back. The scraping of the metal legs against the stone floor was the loudest sound in the universe. He took off his spectacles, cleaned them with the hem of his tunic, and folded them away. He stood up, stretched his back, and waited. Cyan Vales stared down, his mandibles frozen. The data on his datapad was impossible. Results, the Archon's voice boomed, but this time it was vocal, vibrating the air, not the mind. Candidate Croc's failure, total systemic collapse. Candidate Jayal, failure, diplomatic annexation. Candidate Thrum, failure, solar destabilization. The Archon paused. The pause stretched for an eternity. Candidate Elias Thorn, success. Sector stabilized, casualty rate 38%. Territory loss 12%, threat neutralized. A murmur broke out, a wave of disbelief crashing through the assembly. 38% casualties was horrific by their standards, but success was absolute. Vales couldn't contain himself. He activated his gravlift and descended into the arena, hovering just above the floor near the human. "This is an error," he barked, his voice synthesizing through his external speakers. "Look at the casualty count, 3 billion dead. He destroyed the warp gates. He abandoned the outer rim. This is not governance, this is butchery. He did not use the lattice. He could not possibly have calculated the economic repercussions of severing the trade routes." Elias turned to look at the hovering alien. The human's eyes were dark, tired, but remarkably clear. There was no blue glow, no glaze of data overload. "I didn't calculate the economic repercussions," Elias said, his voice raspy but steady. It was the first time he had spoken. "I calculated the survival of the species. You were trying to solve a puzzle. I was fighting a war." "You used no interface," Vales accused, pointing a trembling claw. "You are deaf to the archive. How did you know the plague was linked to the fleet? The data was buried in exabytes of noise. It would take a biological mind years to sift through it." "That's why you missed it," Elias replied, stepping closer to the hovering Cyan. "You process everything. You hear every drop of rain, so you don't notice the storm. I can't hear the archive. I can't see the exabytes. I only saw what was in front of me. I saw a pattern because I wasn't distracted by the history of 1,000 other plagues that looked similar but weren't. You have too much memory. You have forgotten how to guess." "To guess," Vales recoiled as if struck. "You gambled the fate of a sector on a guess." "A hypothesis," Elias corrected. "Intuition, it's what we have instead of the lattice. It's efficient." "It is primitive," Vales spat. "It worked," Elias said simply. The High Archon descended from the ceiling, a towering construct of gold and light. The room fell silent. The Archon floated before Elias, its sensory clusters analyzing the small, soft creature. "The human is correct," the Archon stated, the voice resonating with a terrifying finality. "The simulation was designed to introduce an out-of-context problem, a variable that had no precedent in the archive. The lattice relies on precedent. It predicts the future based on the past. When the past offers no solution, the lattice loops. It freezes. The human improvised. He severed the limb to save the body. It is a logic that the Concordat has evolved beyond, to our detriment." The Archon turned to the assembly. "We have spent 10,000 years perfecting the unity of mind. We have become a single, perfect organism. But we have forgotten that the universe is not perfect. It is chaotic. And to fight chaos, one must be able to think alone." The twist, however, was yet to come. The Archon did not dismiss the class. The lights did not come up for dismissal. Instead, the holographic ceiling shifted. The simulation map of the Antares meridian vanished, replaced by a real-time star chart of the galactic fringe, the unknown darkness beyond the Concordat's borders. Red warning lights began to pulse in the hall, real ones. This assessment was not a simulation, the Archon revealed. The silence in the room became vacuum-tight. The data feed was live. The Antares meridian is not a hypothetical sector. It is the designate for the Omega Frontier, a colony cluster we lost contact with 3 cycles ago. The blood drained from the faces of the candidates who were conscious. They had been playing a game, or so they thought. "The enemy," the Archon caught, "Inude is real. We do not know what they are. The lattice cannot talk to them. The archive has no record of them. Our fleets have been paralyzed because our admirals are connected to the lattice, and the enemy is broadcasting a signal that introduces a logic virus into our shared consciousness. Every fleet we send falls into a feedback loop and shuts down." The Archon drifted closer to Elias. "The signal affects any mind connected to the neural interface. It turns our greatest strength into our tomb. We are paralyzed. We are blindingly fast, yet we are frozen. The great alien leader lowered its head, a gesture of unprecedented submission. We did not invite the Terran Union here to mock you, candidate Elias. We did not invite you to see if you were worthy of us. The Archon gestured to the vast, terrifying map of the encroaching darkness. We invited you because you are the only ones who can fight in the silence. You are the only ones who can fly the ships without the lattice. We need you to lead our fleets. We need you to disconnect us. Vales, the arrogant scion, looked at the human. The disdain was gone, replaced by a primal, shaking fear. He looked at the wire-framed spectacles in Elias' hand, then at the dead, smoking ports of his own interface. He realized that for all his processing power, for all the speed of his thoughts, he was merely a terminal in a network that had just been hacked. The human was a firewall. Elias looked at the map. He saw the red tide of the enemy. He didn't see data streams. He didn't see economic impacts. He saw a line that needed to be held. He put his glasses back on. If we lead, Elias said, his voice echoing in the chamber, we do it our way. No committees, no consensus, no lattice. Agreed, the Archon said. Then give me a console, Elias said, rolling up his sleeves. And get me a cup of coffee. This is going to be a long night. The atmosphere in the room shifted. The mockery was dead. The ancient fear of the dark had returned to the high-tech races of the galaxy, and they looked at the small, lonely figure at the desk not as a savage, but as the only torchbearer left in a universe that was suddenly, terrifyingly dark. The human began to type. Clack, clack, clack. It was the only sound in the room, and it sounded like hope. The scion Vales watched the human work. He tried to process the feeling rising in his chest, searching the archive for a definition. There was no data, but deep down in the vestigial biological part of his brain that the lattice hadn't quite erased, he found the word. Respect. The human finished his command sequence. The real-time map on the ceiling shifted. A fleet of Concordat dreadnoughts, previously drifting dead in space, ignited their engines. They were under manual control. The silence of the human mind had cut through the noise. Course plotted, Elias said, not looking up. Let's go say hello. The screen reflected in his glasses, two twin squares of light in the darkness, the only guidance left for an empire falling blind. The assessment was over. The war of silence had begun, and the humans, the lonely, quiet, unaugmented humans, were the only ones who could hear the enemy coming. The camera pulled back, rising high above the candidate, above the Archon, through the glass ceiling of the spire up into the cold vacuum of space where the stars burned indifferent and cold. It panned to the edge of the galaxy where a shadow was moving, a shadow that screamed in a frequency only machines could hear. But the ships were moving now, silent, deadly, guided by hands of flesh and blood. The universe held its breath. And